Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to a fun episode today. I'm thinking of starting to try to do these kind of fun one-off videos that are just me talking off the top of my head. I used to do this with like my top 5 series where I just take a random topic and give a top 5 list about it in the category of progressive rock in some form. And I'm trying to bring that back in a little bit of a way, and I thought a fun topic that basically was inspired by other videos I've seen of Prog Corner. I think did a live stream about the big 6 classic prog bands and what the best album from them is and what the worst album is from them. And it got me thinking, I honestly am not a huge fan of every band in the Prog 6, the big 6 prog bands that seems to be touted by everybody. And it got me thinking about what is my personal big 6 classic prog bands that brought me into the genre that I continue to love and find a lot of enjoyment from, and to talk through some of the bands that are traditionally considered in the big 6, but that I just don't connect with quite so much. I find stuff to enjoy from all of these bands, don't get me wrong, and I love certain albums by even some of the classic prog bands that aren't like my top tier favorites, but there's just certain bands that connect with me while others don't tend to, as at least not as consistently. And I think it just all comes down to personal preference and taste. All these bands are objectively great bands, and I know a lot of my viewers love all these bands, even if they aren't particularly ones that I, loved with my full heart all the time. So I want to talk that through. So the big 6 typically seems to be Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, ELP, Jethro Tull, and Pink Floyd. I believe I covered it. Just do it off the top of my head, so if I forget one, I apologize. But yeah, those are considered the big 6 prog bands, and I agree with 3 of the 6, but I would replace 3 of them with 3 others that stand out to me more, just from my own personal preference and what impacted me in my development in appreciating progressive rock music. So I'll start with the 3 that I have in common. Yes, of course, would be on my big 6. I love Yes. They're probably my favorite of the classic generation of prog bands, and I love their trajectory into kind of the modern era. They have great albums throughout their catalog, and of course you could nitpick about certain albums that don't stack up as well. But when you talk about their classic, like 70s period, from the Yes album all the way up, for me, even through Drama, really, I find all those records to be classics. I know some people don't love Tormato, some people have issues with Tales, but it's just all such great material, so adventurous, so exciting. I just love Yes, and how they're able to have this adventurous nature, but also very accessible in a lot of ways. They have some genuine hits and some genuine songs that just grab your ears immediately off the bat and are just catchy and fun, great hooks, great melodies. They bring a lot of elements to the table. It's this perfect conglomeration of different musicians from different musical backgrounds. They do have an ever-shifting lineup of different musicians, but I kind of love that it's kind of this odd family, dysfunctional family of people that come in and out of the band, but all have the same spirit and the same vision. And so I love Yes. I think they're one of the best bands of this big 6 group, and to me are the clear watermark for what's great in progressive rock music. If I was to share with someone, what's something I should check out if I want to explore progressive rock, I would probably give them one of Yes's 70s albums like Fragile, or maybe the Yes album itself, or Close to the Edge. I think it's hard to beat those albums as like an introduction into progressive rock. I also would have on my list Genesis. I don't think that surprises anyone. I think Genesis are kind of the yang to Yes's yin. I think these are kind of the big 2 that vie back and forth for my love and affection. And a lot of this is because this stems from my dad, and he loves these bands above all the others in the big 6, certainly, and I feel the same way. Genesis is just so fun and interesting. They have such a character and personality. I love the Peter Gabriel era, of course. I think the run from like Nursery Crime up through The Lamb is just perfect material. And of course, beyond that, I love Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering. I think they went in an interesting direction with Phil Collins doing the lead vocals and kind of taking charge there. And I even like them into their 80s stuff. I think there was always something interesting about what they were doing. They always had something quirky and different that set them apart from kind of your contemporary pop and rock music of the time periods. And maybe not every album absolutely works for me 100%. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of like We Can't Dance and Calling All Stations, but beyond those, like everything that came before, I'm pretty on board with. There's tracks here and there, certain songs that I don't think quite work or measure up from like their 80s period, but the albums themselves are pretty solid and I really enjoy them, and their embracing of kind of quirky fantasy type settings and just this really fun aesthetic for the band. So that would be on my list as well. The other of the top six, the traditional big six, that would be on my list is Jethro Tull, which has been somewhat of a later realization. Like, my dad wasn't really huge into Jethro Tull. He shared Thick as a Brick with me, which I always loved right from the beginning. But I discovered the rest of their catalog on my own. I did a ranking of Jethro Tull albums on the channel a few years back, and that was really my exposure to a lot of these albums I hadn't heard before. And I love the variety of these different records. They, you know, of course have a folky element, but also a bit of a hard rock angle. And of course, bringing in that classic rock and some of those early blues based records as well. I just love the playfulness, the fun, all those 70s records, you know, from Aqualung all the way up through Heavy Horses at least, and probably even beyond that, are just really classic records that I love every bit of. And I feel like there's a lot of variety there to explore. Some songs that lean more in a folky way, some that lean more into that harder rock edge, but always really smart and intelligent lyrics. And I think A Passion Play is one of the most underrated prog records of all time. It's one of my favorites that people don't seem to think as highly of necessarily. So those are the big six that I tend to agree with. The others, I wouldn't be on my big six list. I know that's maybe shocking to some. And I love and enjoy a lot of their records, but I find that I like specific periods, but the band as a whole doesn't quite speak to me as much. Pink Floyd, I love, of course, the run of records. This is probably the most basic take in the world, but I love, you know, Dark Side of the Moon, Through the Wall. I think those are some great seminal rock albums. I always don't feel like they're quite as like overtly proggy as some of these other groups, but I do like their more expansive sound and like some of the sound design elements. You know, I think Dark Side of the Moon is a great produced album, and you know, one that every rock fan needs to have in their collection. I really like Wish You Were Here. That's probably my favorite Pink Floyd record. The Wall is a little hit or miss. Maybe I just don't like some of the more angry sides to the band. Roger Waters is kind of a polarizing figure to me, and I don't really care for his like solo material, and I don't really care for the early like more psychedelia stuff of Pink Floyd. It's just not really my taste particularly. So I feel like there's such a small window of releases that I like that it's hard for me to consider them one of my all-time favorite bands when I just like basically this 4-album period of time from them. But you know, so I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. I know they have a huge following and for good reason, but it's just not my particular taste. Same with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Like, I really like their run of albums from their self-titled debut all the way through like Brain Salad Surgery. You know, I think they have a brilliant run of records. I really like Trilogy. I like Tarkus. I think all those albums are really great classics. But once again, sometimes it's a little hit or miss. Sometimes there's a brilliant epic piece on their album, and then there's like these weird shorter tracks that don't really work for me, that are just kind of weird experiments or kind of these boogie tracks that are kind of silly and out of place. And I don't know if ELP has quite stood the test of time as well as some of these other groups. Like, some of their music feels a little dated to me listening to it now. But like I said, some of their big prog epic stuff I still really like. And I don't really care for like their albums post Brain Salad Surgery. The Works albums are disjointed and don't really work as a whole for me. Love Beach has a lot of, you know, critics. I actually don't think it's as bad as people seem to say it is, but it's also not up to the level of like their classic records. And then anything that came after that is pretty much just stuff I can't even listen to. It's just not really for me. So, you know, I have kind of mixed bag relationship with them a little bit. But I, do have love for kind of this classic period. And then King Crimson, I think I've gone on record saying I don't really understand King Crimson very well. Like, it's just not my style. Like, it's too angular, too out there, too experimental. And I can respect it. I respect the musicianship and what they're going about doing. And there's certain records that I still have in my collection and like. I like, of course, In the Court of the Crimson King, the very first. I do like Red quite a bit, Lark's Tongue and Aspic. So there's certain material that I do pick up and enjoy. But, it's just not a band I tend to listen to a ton. And I don't really care for like them and through the 80s and beyond. Isn't really my style of music, really. So I've never really connected with them very deeply, but I respect and like certain pieces from their catalog. And I like what they did for the genre and how they brought this experimental nature to their music. But those are the bands that I wouldn't quite add. But for my top 6 personally, I would add Gentle Giant. I know they're not quite as widely known as some of the others, but they're right on the fringes of this big 6. They're one of the 3 bands that my dad loves and really introduced me to when he was introducing me to prog. So it was really Yes, Genesis, Gentle Giant. To me, those are like in lockstep the top 3 prog bands of the 70s. And they just have such a consistent catalog. They didn't outstay their welcome. They called it quits right when they needed to, and things weren't really working in their favor anymore. But such intricate, complex music, a lot of different instrumentation. They're all just so talented and can play various different things, and I just love the vocal rounds and counterpoint element, which is taken on by a lot of my favorite modern prog bands as well, like Haken and Neil Morse. So they've inspired a lot of great prog and just really eclectic and cool, and have just a really cool funky vibe to them sometimes. Shorter tracks, but they're all earworms and interesting and fun to listen to and intricate and a lot of layers to unpack, but always listenable. I just have always really adored them. And the next 2 that I put on my list, probably coming from my North American bias perhaps, but I would add in Rush. I think their catalog is really exciting to me. It's another band I came into a little bit later than most, but I like how they're just a rock trio, but they're able to build these kind of worlds and these sci-fi concepts, especially their 70s records, and just have a sound that's all their own, that's uniquely them. Of course, I love 2112, and I love, Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. That era of the band is really excellent to me. And I even like them going off into the 80s, taking prog kind of in a new direction where they weren't selling out and just doing pop albums, kind of like what Genesis was doing, but still doing interesting music, but that fit in with the time frame they were working with. And I think it's brilliant what they were able to accomplish, and adding synths and things to their music added another element. They've just always had integrity to me. They always have done what feels right to them, while adapting to the music as it changes over time. Even into the 90s, they adapted into more of a 90s rock kind of style, but it was still uniquely their take on it, which I thought is brilliant. So I've really enjoyed Rush, and the more I listen to their records, the more I appreciate what they're doing for the genre. And so I would put them right in the mix here in the top 6. And the last one was kind of the tricky one. Those 5 are pretty cemented for me. But I'm adding Kansas because I think they deserve a bit more love, and I really think their catalog through the 70s is pretty flawless. And their first 5 or 6 records are just classic prog rock. Some people turn their nose up at it, say it's not real prog or whatever, or they just know the hits like Carry On Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind. But there's so much great proggy stuff here, and it's cool to have an American band on this list who are doing exciting things and are actually a well-received popular band. A lot of American prog just didn't really make a splash back in those days, and it was very much, prog was like a UK thing, honestly, in the grand scheme of things. But they were able to branch out and create great music, and they have a little touch of that Gentle Giant side to them. They have great violin work, but they're able to also rock out and just do some really exciting music that's fun as a rock musician and rock fan. So it just basically takes everything and puts it into this perfect stew. Great singer, great musicianship, and every album just has these hidden gems, these prog epics that you wouldn't expect from this like classic rock band. My mind was blown because I think I was one of those people who knew them for their classic rock hits, and once I delved into their catalog, I'm like, wow, they're surprisingly like super progressive in all of these like albums. I didn't know this, and so that's really excited me. And I like the revival of some of their most recent albums as well. The Absence of Presence that came out a few years ago, one of my favorite modern prog records. I think they really, even though it's a different lineup and, you know, they don't have so many of their classic members anymore, I think they still have that spirit of, you know, great American progressive rock, which I think is missing in a lot of conversations about classic prog. So that would be my big six. Yes, Genesis, Gentle Giant, Jethro Tull, Rush, and Kansas. Those are the bands that speak most to me. But of course, you know, that's just my opinion and just my personal taste. And I'm not trying to knock the bands that I left off my list, you know, the King Crimson, Pink Floyd, you know, those bands, ELP, I love them dearly. I love specific albums and specific tracks from their catalog. I just don't feel as much of the devotion and fandom for those bands as I do for the six that I mentioned. So I thought this was an interesting take on it. You know, there's kind of the objective big six that just sparked the public in, you know, the biggest ways, but I find it interesting to find what people's personal big six. And like I said, I'm trying to restrict this to like the 70s bands, you know, the original wave of classic progressive rock. And I'm thinking of doing a modern version of what my big six of modern prog would be in a future episode. So if you want to put your list in the comments of what your big six would be of classic prog rock. I also considered Renaissance for this list, another band that I love that I feel is underrated and has such a great run of records through the 70s. So that would be kind of an honorable mention. Camel is another great band that I think deserves some recognition. But once again, probably similar to like ELP, there's like a specific period in time that I like their records, and I'm not a big fan outside of it perhaps, but you know, those are some. I'm not a huge fan of Van der Graaf Generator. I'm trying to think of like all the different prog bands that I didn't mention yet, but Van der Graaf Generator, kind of similar to King Crimson. It's taking me a while to really develop a taste for that. It's just kind of too out there for me at the moment. So those are some of my thoughts about a lot of these classic rock bands. Sorry if I missed your favorite in my discussions here. So thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully this was a fun off-the-cuff episode, and we'll see if I decide to do more of these in the future. So bye everybody, enjoy the music, and I'll see you in a future episode. Bye everybody.